Welcome to another 21 Hats Dashboard brought to you by our sponsor, The Great Game of Business. I'm Lauren Feldman, and I'm here with Gene Marks. Welcome, Gene.
Hello, Lauren. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How about you?
Good.
All right, so here we are. It's Monday morning. I'm curious, what's going on? What are you, Gene Marks, thinking about these days?
Well, so I have a bunch of presentations booked for actually a few in the coming weeks and then a bunch in the fall and into next year. And remember, I talk to business groups, Lauren. I like to talk a little bit about the economy as well as, labor and regulations and, workplace and tech and all that. And I've been kind of like obsessed about the whole back and forth about, our quote unquote runaway deficits and high, national debt. And years ago when I was doing this, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I would talk about the national debt and deficit issues because it's always been an issue, and like people's eyes would glaze over, because it's like, the numbers are just so crazy that it's hard for somebody running a business to like get their arms around. You know what I mean? They're
Sure.
Right. It's like, geez, what can we do about this? So what I do when I'm going to present something is I like to write about it first. So I can use the places that I write to do like my research and formulate my thoughts, and then use that data and that research, then put it into like a presentation form to talk about it. So this is kind of like a test. Like I want to talk about this with you today, if you don't mind, because I'm working on it, and we're kind of like, I feel like I'm Chris Rock going on stage at a comedy club to like test out material. You know what I mean?
We're workshopping it, right?
Workshopping it is exactly right. But I think it's important. And so the piece that I'm writing right now, and you'll see in The Hill, it'll be out this week. It's called, Panicking About Our Deficits. Here are 3 reasons why you shouldn't be, which is a little contrarian because everybody.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised. I thought you might go the other way.
So let me go through. Let me tell you, first of all, what the 3 reasons are. We can dig into it. Okay. And I have numbers to back all this up, so we can dig into that too. But, reason number 1 is that there is going to be a reckoning on our federal deficit, on our budget issues, and our deficit and our national debt issues. The issue is that we just don't know when it will be. So that's number 1. It could be 20 years from now. It could be 5 years from now. No economist has ever been able to predict anything like this. So, it's, to panic today is not really relevant. And again, this might be an issue that continues to get kicked down the line for future generations to deal with or not. So number 1 is, like I'm saying, you shouldn't be panicking, because even though there's going to be a reckoning, we just don't know when that reckoning is going to happen. Number 2, and again, we can dig into this, is that I know for a fact, I just know, and I know it's my opinion, but the U.S. is never going to default on its debt. And the reason why is that there are too many other options. And we can talk about what those options are. It's not, we're not going to see a default of U.S. debt in our lifetimes. I don't believe, other than an act of God pushing us into it. And number 3, though, I do believe that gradually business owners like you and me and everybody else in our audience, I truly believe that we will be living in a world of just higher inflation and interest. I think the days of 0%, interest and 1% inflation, I think are going to be behind us. And I think that we are, because to manage this issue, unless significant steps are taken, we're going to have to get used to higher inflation and interest rates. Between 5 and 10% on both. And that's going to be the new normal of doing business over the next few years and into the next 20, 30 years. And we better get used to it. So I don't think it's a reason to panic. I just think that it's just going to change the playing field a little bit. So number 1, I don't think there's going to be, there's going to be a reckoning. We just don't know when it's going to be. So you shouldn't be panicking. Number 2, I don't believe that the U.S. will default on its debt, because there are just too many other options for it not to. And number 3, though, from a business owner standpoint, you shouldn't panic, but you should be preparing yourself for a higher inflation and interest environment going forward. Do those 3 reasons make sense to you, Lauren? What are your comments?
I'm curious about a number of aspects. Let me start by asking you this. I know you have a lot of clients, you talk to them a lot.
Yep.
Do you have a sense that they believe this is an issue that affects them directly?
No, I mean, it's a really great question. I mean, we are all so busy with our day-to-day problems that when we hear and we read about these like high, national debt and our ongoing budget deficits and our out of control government spending, it just seems so, out there that most of my clients, all of my clients, are like, hey man, what am I going to do? You know what I mean? I can't fix this. That's supposed to be for our politicians. And, in this, in this political environment, no one's going to come to any agreement. So what are you going to do? And so and I think that's a good answer because there is not a lot we can do, but we should be preparing. I mean, I think that that the environment that we're going to be doing business in is going to be changing a lot over the next 20 years. And I think it's going to be caused by the pressure that these deficits and national debt are going to place on our overall spending by the government.
Let me ask you about your prediction that interest rates and inflation are going to stay higher than they've been. I don't think anybody ever expected interest rates to stay where they were. We essentially went through a period of free money coming out of the Great Recession. To some extent, it's a good thing that that's over, I think. It means we're returning to a more normal economy. Same thing with inflation. I think the Fed's goal is to have inflation around 2%. Nobody thinks the goal should be 0%. It has come down. We've gotten close to that. So it's actually below where you're saying we might have to live with it. Why are you expecting inflation to get higher again?
I'll tell you the reason why. When you look at the numbers, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the amount that we're being spent on interest alone is exploding over the next 10 years. It's going to go from about 3% of GDP to about 4% of GDP. It's going to be like 1/6 of our government spending will be on interest. And again, this is according to the Congressional Budget Office. So how do you fix this? I mean, the money's got to come from somewhere, right, Lauren? I mean, we have to pay for this somehow. Now, we can increase taxes, but obviously that's politically untenable. Or we can decrease costs and cut programs like Social Security and Medicaid, which, those things seem politically untenable. And my prediction is that I don't see anybody in political office having the balls to be able to do anything about either government spending or taxation that's going to be making such a big difference to this. So in the end, what does the government have to do? Well, to satisfy its obligations, it's going to have to print more money. That's just the bottom line. And the U.S. government can do this. Greece couldn't do this a few years ago when it went into default because it's tied to the euro. Other economies like Ireland and Sweden and New Zealand, who also had deficit issues, their economies just weren't big enough to sustain their deficits. Whereas the U.S., it's the world's largest economy and safest economy in the world. So what the U.S. government will do is it's just going to print more money, which is going to put a lot of pressure on inflation. And if they're going to be printing more money, two things will happen. The Federal Reserve is going to have to continue to keep interest rates at a higher level to do their best to restrain the money that comes into the system. But then also, as the debt themselves, the bonds that the government will have to issue will have that much more risk. Higher interest rates are going to be needed to continue to attract investors. So I think we're going to see a combination of inflationary pressures and also reasons to keep interest rates at higher levels than they've been historically to maintain that balance. That's what I see happening. And the reason why this ties it back into our audience and business owners in general, that if this does happen, if the government doesn't default, which I don't think they will, if there's nobody out there that's going to significantly restrict spending or significantly increase taxes, and I don't think we're in a political environment where that's going to happen, I think the only other logical choice is just to issue more money, and that just is going to cause more inflation and interest pressures.
I think there are a couple of things worth noting there. One is I liked what you said about Greece. I think there is often in this conversation some concern that we could go through what Greece went through, although they seem to be doing better now, I think. But they went through a tough time coming out of the Great Recession where they had huge deficits. The key difference being, as you said, they owed that money to other people, other countries
Yeah.
outside of Greece, which makes a huge difference. We owe the money to ourselves,
Right.
largely, not exclusively, but largely. And that means that those payments stay in circulation in our economy, which is a much better thing, and important to note. I don't necessarily want to get into this debate, but you also you wrote off the possibility of of increasing taxes as untenable.
Yeah.
At a certain point, that does become tenable. Taxes have been raised in the past. I know we're at a point in our political evolution where getting anything done seems all but impossible. But, there are solutions to things like the problem with Social Security that could involve lifting the cap on, how much people have to pay, that could solve that problem fairly easily. So it may not be impossible to raise taxes at some point if need be.
But let me just interrupt you and say
please.
that I do agree with you that it's certainly possible that could happen. My bet is that it won't, at least not to a significant extent. And my history walking this planet has seen that whenever governments raise taxes, they just use it to spend more money. And I've also seen that whenever there's tax increases or tax cuts, they tend to turn around in a few years when new administrations or new political environments take place. So although I'm saying it's not impossible, reforming Social Security is not impossible. I mean, of course, I just think it's more likely that nothing will happen or nothing substantial will happen from either austerity. I mean, remember Canada, Sweden, New Zealand, they did a combination of austerity. They had cost cuts as well as they had tax increases, and that brought their deficits to a more manageable level, which, by the way, that's where it has to be, a manageable level. It doesn't have to be eliminated, But those countries also have national health care, national education. They have programs they can do because they're so much smaller, as a country. This country is so huge that to put an across the board austerity measures or across the board, tax increase measures, I don't think the U.S. is capable of doing that for the same reason that we can't have an across the board, national health system or better system for higher education to pay for it, because we're just too big and too unwieldy and too complicated. And that's why I think that the chance of something significant happening either on cost cutting or revenue generation is going to decrease the deficits. I think that chance is minimal. That's what I'm betting on as a business owner. Does that make sense?
It does. I also would just point out that I don't think austerity always works the way it's hoped for. And I know you're very familiar with the UK. You spend a good bit of time there. They just had a big change in government. In part, I think it's fair to say, because austerity hasn't gone the way the Conservative Party, which had been in power for, 14 years, hoped it would. So that's tricky. Here's the other thing that I think is interesting to think about from a business owner's perspective, which is you have to remember how we get into this situation. And part of it is the government does tend to spend more money when economic times are tough. And that was certainly the case in the Great Recession. That was certainly the case during COVID. You can certainly make the argument that the government spent too much money, especially during COVID. But putting that money in circulation was helpful to a lot of businesses, tremendously helpful. I mean, it was helpful to individuals as well, especially in COVID. The debt levels for consumers went down considerably. They had money to spend. It made a big difference. Part of the reason we had a much better recovery than most other countries around the world, that was to the benefit of business owners. Reducing the deficit may not always be to their benefit in the same measure.
True. And also, if I could just say, even with the jobs numbers that came out last week, 90% of the increase in the jobs numbers came from, government jobs and social service and healthcare jobs, so government spending does have not only its impact on, for businesses, but also helps people, get work, and get employed. So there is all of that good stuff. But again, even after the spending that happened during and post pandemic, that's contributed to all of the rising deficits and our rising national debt. So, the spending is great. It did, it certainly helped people, and no one can argue that, but it has to be paid for at some point. Do you know what I mean? And the issue that I have is how's that going to be paid for? These deficits continue to rise, And like I said, interest is expected to explode over the next 10 years. Something's got to be done. Like the money's got to come from somewhere. Do you know what I mean? And again, we keep tying this back to us as business owners. Why do we care, and how does that affect us? And my point is that barring any acts of God or significant depressions or recessions or whatever, or pandemics, I think the likely scenario that is going to impact our businesses over the next 10 to 15 years is we are going to be operating our businesses in a higher inflationary and interest rate environment. And I think that will impact all of us in a number of ways. I think I will see a lot of my clients double down on technology. I see that they will be, getting used to, targeting their price increases. I think that will be the norm more so than ever before. I think my best clients will get better at forecasting their cash flow and minimizing their wasteful activities. I think just like we've seen in the past couple of years, the cost of capital will increase, will be at a higher level. So banks will be lending less or scrutinizing financing a lot more than we've ever seen before, because they want to make sure people can maintain and pay back that debt. I think there'll be limited capital for startups and businesses that are in need. I think all of these things are going to be sort of the new normal. I think we've seen it in the past year or two, mainly because of the inflation that came from the pandemic and recent government spending. But I think this inflation and high interest rates, I think, is going to be part of our, it's going to be a normal part of doing business. Gone will be the days of these 2 to 3% rates. I think you're going to be seeing rates in the 5 to 10% range. And by the way, I don't think any of this is catastrophic.
Well, I was going to ask you, let me ask you this. You again, talking to your clients all the time, do you get a sense that we've learned anything operating in the inflationary period that we have in recent years? I mean, nobody likes inflation, neither consumers nor business owners. But to some extent, we've gotten used to it. And I think, there sometimes are silver linings there. I mean, for consumers, wages went up as well. For business owners, until recently, I don't think there's ever been a time when it was easier to raise prices than it has been, because everybody was raising prices. There was no penalty to pay for that. It became expected. That I don't think is the case anymore. But were inflation to go to the levels you're talking about, it probably would become the expectation again. Can we live with inflation more comfortably than we thought we could?
Most economists will tell you that there is an acceptable level of inflation for any economy for all the reasons that you just said. And that acceptable level is anywhere from 3 to 5%. It varies depending on who you read, but that level maintains that wages are increasing at a decent level and that businesses can increase their prices where they can, and an economy can grow that way. Obviously, you don't want to be in the hyperinflation era of Argentina or Germany after the First World War. But a level of 3 to 5% is considered to be that sort of acceptable level, and businesses will have to. I think businesses are going to get used to that. I think it could be higher. I mean, I don't think that that's acceptable, but I think it's something we're going to have to accept, because unless, again, the money can be found from somewhere else to pay down, these debts and deficits, I think there's going to be too many pressures on inflation that the Fed just won't be able to control with interest rate as a tool. And I think that we should all, as both consumers and business owners, be expecting a higher interest and inflationary environment in the years to come.
Well, I think I've exhausted my ability to pretend to be an economist. Do you have anything else left to say?
No, I think there's a lot of opportunities when when you're in that environment. And again, people in financial services will find themselves making more money. People that are that have the ability to be flexible with their pricing, like you just said. I mean, in an inflationary environment, that opens up a lot of opportunities to inflate your prices to as much or even more than you need, as opposed to being in a non-inflationary environment where that's not, the case. So there's certainly opportunities that I think that people will be jumping on. And I do think that people that are either in the tech sector or have the funds available to invest in technology, those are also going to be the winners over the next decade. Because they're really going to be forced into making those adjustments. The losers in all of this are the losers. They're always the losers in all of this, which is the people that have lower incomes or the poor, or that don't have that flexibility. and they can't do anything about it. And that's the challenge. That's the biggest issue that we're going to see. But I guess the takeaway is if you're running a business, and I talk about this, I'll be talking about this to business groups, I would have in the back of your mind that, this inflationary environment that we're in right now is not going to go away. And in fact, it's probably going to get worse over the next 10 to 15 years. And I just think you should be preparing your operations to deal with that. That's my advice.
Gene, I think, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to talk to you for a few weeks while you travel a little bit. Maybe you'll bring back some reports with how other countries are dealing with this.
I will be, and also I will be, even though I'm, I'll go to the UK and go to France to see friends, but I'll be writing. So we'll have tons of topics to talk about when I get back. Okay.
Excellent. I will look forward to that. Gene Marks is a CPA who writes weekly on small business for The Guardian, The Hill, The Philadelphia Inquirer, The Washington Times, The Chicago Daily Herald, Forbes, and Entrepreneur. You can also hear him on ABC Radio's Eye on the World with John Batchelor. Gene hosts 2 small business podcasts with Paychex Corporation and The Hartford. This episode was brought to you by The Great Game of Business. You can learn more about them at greatgame.com. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you, Lauren. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Have a great week, everybody.